Luke, the 13th chapter. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There is a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'How much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal home. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Grace, peace, and mercy are yours from the triune God. Amen. This is my kind reminder to you that I do not pick the readings for the week. But it does give me opportunity to tell one of my favorite stories. So, a few years ago, while I was in seminary, I worked at a music venue checking IDs at the door. I was a door guy or a bouncer. Quite the job when you're in seminary. And one night during after hours, which means the bar is closed, probably around like 3 o'clock in the morning, after a relatively uneventful night, the bar staff and some of the locals who are friends of ours were hanging out having a couple beers. And one of the locals there happened to be a drug dealer, which was not unusual for us. It's a dive bar. And he asked me if I wanted to do a line of coke with him, and I politely declined. Now, I was sort of new at this point around the bar, and so me and this local didn't know each other very well. So he was trying to make friends with me and make sure I was on the level. So he offered me what he had. The man grew up in El Salvador, and he had been a member of a gang in town there and had some tattoos around his face, and by all accounts was maybe not the safest person to make angry. And again, I was new around there. And so when I declined his offer, he got a little suspicious of me. He looked at my friend Dave, who had gotten me the job and had been around a lot longer than I had, and asked who I was. He had raised his voice, and he started wondering if I was a cop. I kind of look like a cop sometimes. And I was kind of intense. I said, "No, not a cop." And he looked, and his look kind of tilted at me. And still with great confusion, suspicion, and maybe anger, because people don't turn down drugs around the bar very often, especially when they are trying to make friends with people. He asked, "What are you then? A priest?" It's funny. And me and my friend Dave looked at each other and started laughing, which didn't help the situation. And I said, Yeah. I mean, sort of. That is the goal. I explained that I was going to seminary and was going to be a Lutheran pastor or a priest for all intents and purposes. And he looked at me and, of course, didn't believe me because there aren't very many priests hanging around South Broadway at 3 o'clock, and said, "That's really great." He started to get a little teary. He said to me that growing up in El Salvador during the revolution, the priests were always very good to him and his friends. They were one of the only ones who stood by them when they fought the government. He was a teenager when in 1989, 6 priests and their housekeepers were killed in El Salvador, and they stood with the poor and the oppressed and spoke against the government who was taking away their rights and their ability to critique the government. And as the government was passing laws to serve the rich and not those in need, the priests were some of the loudest and most respected voices to stand out. And he and I were always good after that. The act of those faithful Christians gave him a respect for me that I did not earn. And his experience taught me that he understood what Christian discipleship is supposed to be. And I loved him in return. In the text today, there is this manager of an estate, and the owner of the estate calls him into his office, and he doesn't know, and he doesn't like how the manager is managing. He says to the manager, you've been squandering my money. And now I don't know what that means. But the manager is about to get fired, and soon, but not yet, he will have no place in the landowner's house. He will lose his authority. And so he takes this time in between, him knowing that he won't have authority soon, and he still has some authority, to make some decisions. He's worried about how he's going to take care of himself, and now that he will be without this cushy job where he skims off the top of loans, common practice at the time. And because he is too weak to dig and too ashamed to beg, the manager forgives huge chunks of people's loans. What was once 100 jars of oil is now 80 or 50 or whatever. And now at this time, this is common practice with loans. It's just how things worked. There's a lot of interest, and that interest was often pocketed by the person managing it, or part of that was pocketed by the person managing it. Sometimes 20 or 50%. So if you want to get a business going, or you're a farmer, or have or something happens and you simply need money, you go and get a loan and expect to pay back a lot more than you take out. In present day terms, think about like predatory loans, bail bonds, and that kind of thing. Which is, of course, great if you are the person lending that money and getting back all that interest on money that was not yours. Or in the case, if you are working for the person lending the money, like the manager or the steward here in the story. The reason the manager forgives huge chunks of these loans is because people didn't like loan collectors. Imagine, right? It was understood that the lenders of these loans were getting rich off of other people's hard work. And of course, you and I can look at each other and say, well, the people taking out the loans knew what they were getting themselves into. They signed the contract. It was very clear, I'm sure. They knew the expectation, and they should have known that they would have to pay back all that interest. But these loans at that great of an interest rate, they are not fair, and they are unjust. And so the manager tries to make right, because he is going to lose his job anyway, and he needs to make friends with people while he still can, because people do not like him. Now, we often feel like this parable of the dishonest manager is a parable about the manager being dishonest to the landowner. After all, he is giving away great chunks of the landowner's money, or what should, according to the contract people have been entered into, be his money after the people pay him back with interest. But remember, this manager, who we automatically assumes is being dishonest with the landowner's money, is only forgiving 20 or 50% of the loans. The manager is only forgiving the interest. He isn't giving away the landowner's money. He is just not making people pay extra. He is actually being fair. He is actually acting justly. I think this parable might be better titled, "The Manager Who Was Once Dishonest." Now, anytime we read these parables where there is a master or a vineyard owner or a king or a landowner, we jump to the conclusion and try and puzzle together what is going on. We make these allegories, right? We had a heck of a time talking about it in Bible study this week. And we oftentimes assign, in this allegory we make up, God as the most powerful one. And in this position, God would be the landowner, right? The landowner has the power. And sometimes that works for us, but in this case, I don't think it does, because the landowner is getting rich off of other people's misery, which doesn't seem godlike to me. Instead, I kind of wonder if this isn't a parable about how we should treat one another with the justice and love of God, to assure that God is in our relationships through the grace that we have with one another. This word that we translate in English here as dishonest is often translated as unjust in other parts of the Bible. So in my Bible, this parable is titled The Dishonest Manager, but it's probably more accurately The Unjust Manager. And he is being unjust, or at least he was once unjust, right? But choosing himself over the welfare of his neighbor for much of his life by throwing out every rule of justice found in the law of Moses that forbid lending money with interest by getting richer and richer off of these loans, he is moving actually further and further away from the just love of God that God ordains he be present in a godly community. And by trading God's law of justice for the world's unjust laws of greed, he is moving away from God's community of justice and bowing at the feet and the idol of money. That's the way he was. This is once the unjust manager. His actions point towards his values, right? One cannot serve two masters. It's a inaccurate description oftentimes, but people will say, like, show me your checkbook and we'll show you your values, right? Follow the money. That goes for anybody. You look at our country's books and you could say, well, what are your values, right? When he is offering these predatory loans, of course, the love of God cannot be present in his relationships, which is a shame because God desperately wants to be in our relationships with one another. But the manager at this time isn't choosing that. He is pushing God aside for something else that he feels is more important and more worth serving. That's idolatry. And that's how he lives his whole life until one day he finds out that he is going to lose his job. And he realizes that the greed and comfort he has placed his trust in all these years will not be saving him after all. He is falling on his face. He is losing everything. And instead, he finds out that he has been wrong the whole time, and he repents. He turns directions. He turns back to the way of God, and he decides that his comfort or money is actually not as important as being in relationships and having God in his community. At this time, when the manager is called into his boss's office, after he has forgiven these loans, after he has repented back to the just way of God, You might think that the boss is going to be upset, but what can he do? The loans have been forgiven, right? And he knows that the manager has acted shrewdly. He has acted wisely. He has returned to the way of God while he still could. We don't know how this landowner runs his business there on out. Maybe he doesn't loan money with interest anymore. Maybe he gives generously out of what he has been blessed with. Maybe he doesn't. But he does acknowledge that this was the right move for the manager. It is wise, which is just another way of saying it is of God. And all of this story has me thinking about my friend at the bar and the respect and love he shared for the priests that were in his life. Because those priests chose justice when it was hard. They didn't have to, and not every priest did. They were disciples in a hard situation, and they paid for it. That is true. But they were faithful. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to true riches? This is a parable about money, for sure. It is a text about being generous with the gifts of God that are not ours to hoard. Of course it is. Jesus talks about money and the dangers of greed more than almost anything in the whole Bible. But the reason behind that shrewd, wisely, or godly use of money is a call back to the way of God. It is a beacon towards faithfulness. It is about putting our trust in something that has real merit. The promises and true treasures of faith. My friends, priests could have, I am sure, chosen comfort. They could have kept their mouths shut and their heads down. I'm sure they could have sided with the government. I am also sure that people wouldn't have been surprised if they did, because not everyone was so brave, but they chose what was right. They chose the way of God that is always guiding people toward love and community and away from greed and idolatry. And because they made that choice, because they were faithful in what they had, because they chose the way of God, my friend's eyes in the way he held them close in his heart after many years told me that they had both given and received true treasures of heaven. My friend knew what true treasures of heaven was. He had seen it in these people. What a gift. And we know this story in our world, right? We know this tension. We know about choosing comfort in a system set up to punish people and steal rights. Some of us may be wondering if we might also face some of those same choices. Choices where we'll have to pick our own allegiances, our comfort or the gifts of God, rightness, kindness. Perhaps those comparisons will be starkly similar to the ones my friends and the priest faced. I don't know. I hope they're not that way. But we do face those choices. One cannot serve two masters. Let us find ways to invest in the treasures of God. Let us find ways to find God in our relationships, to find kindness, to find grace, to choose it over violence and greed. Let us be people who steward our gifts well, who are faithful and generous with what we have, even at the risk of our discomfort, so that we too can enjoy the treasures of God's way of love and justice in our eyes and in our hearts of one another. to the glory of God. Amen. Well of Hope is an inclusive community of faith in the ELCA. We proclaim God's love for all, we create community through worship, study, and play, and we serve in love. If you want to be a part of this, sign up for our weekly email online here, follow us on our social media, or stop by worship at 10 o'clock at New Hope Presbyterian Church. Go through the big wooden doors on the right. We look forward to seeing you.